Moscow, 1926. A newspaper editor pulls aside one of his journalists, not for missing a detail, but for never taking notes. When confronted, Solomon Shereshevsky simply repeats the entire meeting, word for word. The editor doesn't congratulate him. He sends him to a neurologist. What they uncovered was a mind that could never forget. Not a sound, not an image, not a sensation. No upper limit to his memory was ever found. But what sounds like the greatest gift a mind could possess would become something far closer to a prison. The daily morning meetings at the Moscow newspaper offices were filled with rapid-fire instructions, street addresses, and complex daily assignments. Every reporter in the crowded room sat with a pencil in hand, urgently scribbling notes to keep pace with the editor's demands. But one reporter sat in total silence. Solomon Shereshevsky's notebook remained completely blank, his hands resting quietly on the desk. When the editor confronted him about this apparent negligence, Shereshevsky was merely confused. He did not understand the irritation. To demonstrate his attention, he quietly recited the entire morning meeting back to his superior, preserving every name, address, and instructional detail in its exact sequence. He spoke in a calm, steady voice, needing no written record to guide his recollection. Shereshevsky did not view this as a performance. He had lived 40 years assuming that every human mind retained the world in this exact, effortless way. He believed writing things down was a redundant habit, a strange quirk of his colleagues rather than a necessity. The empty pages of his notebook revealed a quiet, unsettling division. The editor did not offer praise for this flawless demonstration. Instead, recognizing that such complete retention was outside the boundaries of normal human capability, he directed the reporter to a local neurologist for evaluation. What began on a routine workday in the newsroom was no longer treated as an extraordinary talent. It was a medical anomaly, a puzzle that required a clinical explanation. Long before he entered any clinic, Solomon Veniaminovich Shereshevsky was simply a man living a quiet, literate life. He was born in 1886 in Torjok, a provincial town northwest of Moscow. His father, Nikolai, ran a modest bookshop, and Solomon grew up surrounded by the smell of paper, ink, and endless rows of printed language. In this quiet environment, words were not things to be studied or memorized. They were the natural background of his childhood. In the early 1900s, Shereshevsky left the provinces for the energy of Moscow, finding work as a journalist. He contributed short cultural reviews and poetry to local publications, including the literary supplement of the newspaper Izvestia. He was an unassuming reporter, eventually marrying a woman named Ada and settling into a modest life. To Shereshevsky, his daily work required no special effort. When he listened to editors or walked the bustling city streets, his mind simply held on to everything. He did not view this as a gift, nor did he think of himself as a prodigy. For the first 40 years of his life, he lived with the absolute certainty that his mind was entirely ordinary. He assumed that every person he passed, every colleague in the newsroom, possessed the same unbroken chain of memory. To him, writing things down was merely a redundant habit, a strange quirk of a world that chose to use paper when they could simply remember. In the quiet laboratories of the Moscow Institute of Psychology, a young researcher named Alexander Luria sat across from Solomon Shereshevsky. It was the late 1920s, and Luria, a patient clinical observer, began with standard memory evaluations, expecting to find the typical boundaries of human recall. Instead, this initial meeting initiated a single-subject longitudinal study that would span more than 30 years. Luria systematically escalated the difficulty of the examinations, seeking the point where the subject's mind would finally falter. He moved far beyond ordinary limits, presenting Shereshevsky with lists of 70 to 100 concrete nouns. Shereshevsky retained them all, reproducing them in exact sequence, forward or backward, without error. The material grew increasingly complex. Luria read aloud intricate algebraic formulas containing nested variables, parentheses, and trigonometric signs. Shereshevsky reproduced the symbols with precise structural notation. He did the same with foreign language poetry, reciting Italian, German, and French stanzas verbatim after a single hearing, despite having no knowledge of the languages themselves. The most striking results appeared over vast intervals of time. In tests of delayed verbal recall, Shereshevsky reproduced exact lists after weeks, months, and eventually 16 years. In these long-term trials, his accuracy remained near flawless, showing almost no omissions and zero false memory intrusions. Luria began to record that there appeared to be no upper limit to his subject's capacity. Yet, historical caution is necessary when evaluating these records. This was a longitudinal case study of a single individual, not a controlled population trial. Modern scholars point to significant methodological limitations, including an absence of control participants and a lack of systematic safeguards against rehearsal effects. The data did confirm, however, that Shereshevsky's recall was semantic and verbal, rather than a fleeting photographic snapshot. His mind preserved the structure and meaning of words with a terrifying permanent durability. For Shereshevsky, these laboratory tests were not intellectual exercises. They were the first rigorous documentation of a mind unable to let go of a single word. For Solomon Shereshevsky, words did not exist as bare verbal units. They were physical, multi-sensory events. When Luria read lists of vocabulary or digits, Shereshevsky did not simply hear the sounds, he lived through them. Every sound produced a distinct color in his visual field. Every word carried a specific physical taste and a tactile texture. Numbers possessed distinct personalities. Some were stern and tall, while others appeared playful and light. Even music manifested as geometric shapes floating before his eyes. This five-fold sensory fusion was not a conscious system of mnemonic tricks or a chosen artistic decoration. It was a persistent, involuntary feature of his daily neurology. Because every stimulus triggered an immediate, automatic cross-activation of all five senses, his brain encoded every single experience with multiple, redundant retrieval routes back to the original moment. A word was never a clean, abstract symbol. It was a heavy sensory packet of a certain color, weight, texture, and taste. To recall the word later, he only had to reconstruct any single part of the sensory blend. But while this rich scaffolding made his retention flawless, it was also highly intrusive. The mechanism of his recall was not a quiet filing system to be opened and closed at will. It actively invaded his daily life. On one occasion, while walking down Nevsky Prospect, Shereshevsky stopped at a street cart. When the ice cream vendor spoke, the tone of her voice immediately triggered a violent visual disruption. He saw a pile of black cinders pour directly from her mouth, a sudden suffocating sensory flood that completely ruined his appetite. The episode showed how easily the recall mechanism could intrude into ordinary waking perception. The very cross-sensory profile that allowed him to retrieve decades-old data without effort could never be switched off. He walked through a world where a passing conversation, a street noise, or a simple question could instantly generate a chaotic storm of colors, tastes, and shapes, crowding his consciousness and turning everyday life into an overwhelming obstacle. The unyielding durability of Solomon's memory created a quiet, persistent friction in his daily life. What appeared to be a flawless system of recall functioned as a rigid barrier to ordinary cognition. Reading a novel became an exhausting struggle. As he attempted to follow a narrative, the descriptive details did not recede to allow a continuous plot to form. Instead, each word generated an immediate, frozen image that lingered in his consciousness, blocking the progression of the story. This mental permanence made abstract thought equally difficult. Abstract reasoning requires the mind to discard specific, physical details in order to form general categories. For Solomon, Concepts that lacked a direct physical representation were hard to comprehend. He remained bound to concrete, individual instances, finding it difficult to move away from the vivid sensory details that anchored his thoughts. This rigidity affected even his perception of others. Human faces are dynamic, changing with age, lighting, and shifting expressions. Because Solomon's stored impressions of people remained entirely fixed, he could not reliably recognize familiar faces as they changed over time. Spontaneous familiarity was replaced by a conscious verbal calculation, where he had to actively piece together physical features and contextual associations to identify a friend. With no natural mechanism to suppress irrelevant data, his mind grew crowded. In a quiet search for relief, Solomon began writing down the memories he wished to discard. He placed these written slips of paper into a small metal container and set them on fire. He watched the paper burn, hoping the physical destruction of the written words would finally erase the mental traces. But while the paper turned to ash, the memories remained completely untouched, as clear as they had been before the flame was lit. For Solomon, the search for a blank slate was met only with the realization that his mind had no capacity to let go. Solomon Shereshevsky abandoned his work as a newspaper reporter to become a professional stage mnemonist. He spent the 1930s and 1940s touring cultural clubs and public halls across the Soviet Union, turning his neurological condition into a theatrical career. On stage, his memory became a public performance. Volunteers from the audience wrote down massive grids of numbers, endless lists of words, or long strings of nonsense syllables. To those watching, he displayed absolute certainty, speed, and control, retrieving facts instantly for crowds of strangers. But this admiration remained entirely external. The applause did not remove the confusion and isolation of his private life. The shift from journalist to performer made his extraordinary ability an occupation, not a refuge. Behind the curtain, the sensory overload and mental crowding continued to dominate his days. He lived a lonely existence, eventually retreating to a modest room in Moscow. His health steadily declined as he aged, and his last years were spent away from the spotlight. On May 1, 1958, Solomon Shereshevsky died in Moscow at the age of 71. The official cause of death was listed as cerebral arteriosclerosis, with his physical decline worsened by chronic alcoholism. He left behind no personal journals or descendants, leaving his life to be understood only through the pages of a clinical study. He was a man who spent his career performing a miracle he could never escape. 10 years after Solomon Shereshevsky's death, his quiet struggle found a permanent place in scientific history. In 1968, Alexander Luria published The Mind of a Mnemonist. This book preserved the details of this exceptional case, carrying it far past the laboratory walls and into the broader understanding of human psychology. Luria's evaluation went far past asking how much information a human brain could hold. Instead, he examined the relationship between preserving information and allowing some of it to disappear. The study proposed that forgetting is an active cognitive process, an essential mechanism that protects the mind, rather than a passive decay or a weakness of our biology. Without this protective mechanism, the conscious mind is crowded by an overwhelming weight of daily impressions. Forgetting reduces interference, allowing us to quiet the background noise of life. It frees the intellect to group separate experiences into categories, rather than leaving us trapped in the prison of individual instances. To form abstract concepts, the mind must select and generalize. It must have the capacity to discard the specifics of a single moment. For example, to understand the general concept of a house, a person must be able to ignore the exact shade of paint, the height of the fence, and the shape of the doorway of every house they have ever seen. When every detail remains perfectly preserved, abstract thought becomes nearly impossible. This case challenges the popular idea that perfect recall represents the highest form of human intelligence. While the book is historically important, it describes a highly unusual state, showing that photographic memory is neither ordinary nor universally attainable. Rather than possessing a superpower, Shereshevsky lived with a significant cognitive limitation. His life suggests that a functional human intellect requires a balance between what we keep and what we let fade. The true strength of human thought relies on both our ability to hold on to our experiences and our quiet capacity to let them slip away. Today we strive for perfect digital permanence, desperate to record and remember everything. Yet Solomon's quiet tragedy reveals a deeper truth. To think, to create, and to truly live, we must be able to let go. Peace lies not in what we keep, but in what we allow to fade. What would you choose to forget? Share your thoughts below.